Hey everyone, I've noticed that many of you are enjoying the videos, but most of you haven't subscribed yet. We're super close to hitting 1,000 subscribers, and your support could help us reach that milestone. If you're enjoying the content, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. It really makes a huge difference and helps us keep creating more awesome content. Thank you so much for watching and supporting. I never imagined my marriage would end in such a messy, unceremonious way. Bethany and I were supposed to be unbreakable, or at least that's what I told myself every time I looked at her. But looking back, the signs were always there. It was just easier to ignore them until it wasn't. It all started with something trivial, a single gold earring lying on our bathroom counter. I stared at it, my toothbrush halfway to my mouth. It wasn't Bethany's style. Hers were either small studs or tasteful hoops, nothing this garish. When I asked her about it, she shrugged and said it belonged to a colleague who'd stayed over for a drink after a long day at work. I remember nodding, not pressing further, but a knot of doubt tightened in my gut, a knot that didn't loosen over time. It stayed with me, grew roots, and eventually sprouted into something more sinister. As the days passed, I found myself replaying that conversation in my head. Had she been too nonchalant? Was that smirk on her face a trace of guilt? Or was it all in my head? I didn't want to be that paranoid husband, the one who sees threats in every corner, yet I couldn't help noticing more things that didn't add up. Late-night text messages, her phone screen lighting up, only for her to swipe the notification away before I could see the sender. Work's been insane, she'd explain, her voice a bit too breezy. Then there were the late nights at the office, the so-called business dinners that didn't end until the small hours of the morning. Every time I tried to ask about them, she'd snap, "Do you really not trust me?" The accusatory edge in her voice always shut me down. How could I accuse her of something I had no proof of? But the doubts persisted. It was like a song stuck in my head, playing on a loop. I became hyper-aware of every interaction, each too casual remark. Conversations with her felt different, as if she was holding something back. Friends started noticing it too. One evening, while out with some of her work friends, I caught a few of them glancing at me when they thought I wasn't looking. It was the kind of look that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up, a mix of pity and discomfort. The final straw came one night when she returned home wearing a dress I'd never seen before. It was a bold red number, far too sexy for her usual conservative style. She looked stunning, no question, but it wasn't her. I tried to joke about it to ease my discomfort. "Trying something new?" I asked, forcing a smile. She laughed, a short, empty sound, and brushed me off with an excuse about a last-minute client dinner. That's when I knew. Something had changed between us. Maybe it had been changing for a long time, but I'd been too blind or too stupid to see it. The next morning, I called in sick. It wasn't like me to skip work, but I couldn't stomach going through the motions anymore. Instead, I sat in the silence of our empty house, scrolling through my phone mindlessly, waiting for a distraction that never came. My eyes landed on a photo of us from a few years back. Bethany smiling with her arm around me at a New Year's party, both of us looking carefree, happy. A perfect illusion. Frustration bubbled up inside me. I needed to know the truth, needed to see if I was just being paranoid. So I did something I'd never imagined doing. I picked up her phone, unlocked it with a code I'd memorized months ago without ever intending to use. It felt wrong, dirty even, but I couldn't stop myself. What I found wasn't the smoking gun I'd expected. There were no incriminating messages, no pictures of her with another man. But there were gaps, entire conversations missing, days where her text history was eerily clean. It was too neat, too deliberate. My heart pounded as I realized that she'd been deleting things, hiding them. The doubts that had been whispering in the back of my mind roared to life. The missing pieces suddenly made the puzzle more ominous. That evening, I watched her closely. Every gesture, every word felt practiced. She seemed almost rehearsed. At dinner, she barely looked at me, her gaze flitting around the room, her smile tightened, unnatural. When I asked how her day was, she gave me a curt, "Fine," and went back to scrolling through her phone. I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. Maybe I was reading too much into everything. Maybe I was the problem, not her. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that she was drifting further and further away, and I had no idea why. But one moment crystallized everything. The first time I saw her texting, her expression softened in a way I hadn't seen in months. It was the look she used to give me, the look of someone who's happy, excited. When she noticed me watching, her face snapped back into a neutral mask. "What?" she snapped, the sharpness of her tone catching me off guard. "Nothing," I murmured, swallowing the acid taste of jealousy and fear. "Just, you look happy." I missed that. For a heartbeat, something flickered in her eyes. Regret? Guilt? But then it was gone, replaced by irritation. "Can we not do this right now, Mark?" She pushed back her chair, grabbed her purse. "I'm exhausted." The door slammed behind her, leaving me alone in the silence of our too-big house. My hands shook as I cleared the dishes, every clatter of porcelain a reminder of how fragile everything had become. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening for the sound of her car returning. I heard it at 3 in the morning. She slipped into bed beside me, the scent of a foreign cologne clinging to her skin. I turned away, bile rising in my throat. This was it, my breaking point. I wasn't going to sit by passively while she unraveled everything we'd built together. I needed to know what was going on. The next day, I started tracking her movements. I wasn't proud of it, but I needed more than suspicion. I needed proof. I'd ask her about her plans casually, pretending to be disinterested, and then I'd drive by the restaurant she said she'd be at, or the client's office she claimed to be meeting. More often than not, she wasn't there. Instead, she'd be at a cafe across town, sitting in a secluded booth, talking animatedly with a man I didn't recognize. Sometimes she'd lean in close, her hand brushing his. The sight of it was like a knife twisting in my gut, but it also gave me clarity. This wasn't in my head. This wasn't me overthinking things. She was cheating. The revelation sent a cold wave of anger through me. I'd spent months doubting myself, twisting in emotional agony, all while she pranced around, flaunting her infidelity right under my nose. But I wasn't going to confront her, not yet. Confrontation meant giving her control of the narrative. I needed a plan, a way to make her regret ever thinking she could deceive me. I wanted her to feel the same pain, the same betrayal I'd been drowning in. I needed to hit her where it would hurt the most, her perfect, carefully constructed life. I followed her that night, a mix of desperation and anger churning in my gut. It wasn't hard. She wasn't exactly careful. After dinner, she claimed she had to stay late at work for some last-minute client issues. I'd heard that lie too many times to count, and tonight, I needed to know for sure. I parked my car down the block from her office building, keeping the headlights off. My fingers tightened around the steering wheel as I waited, my eyes locked on the front entrance. It didn't take long. At exactly 8:17 p.m., Bethany walked out, her silhouette illuminated under the street lamp. But she wasn't alone. A man, tall, broad-shouldered, stepped out beside her, placing a casual hand on her lower back as they moved toward a sleek, black Mercedes. The casual intimacy of the gesture made my stomach lurch. I knew I should leave it there. I'd seen enough to confirm what I already suspected. But I couldn't. I started the car, following them at a distance, my heart thudding like a war drum. The city lights blurred around me as I tailed them, headlights off, keeping just far enough back to avoid suspicion. They pulled up at a hotel, one of those upscale ones with valet parking and gold-trimmed windows. I watched as they handed the keys to the valet and headed inside, their hands brushing together briefly before separating. My vision tunneled. The confirmation hit harder than I'd expected, a physical blow that left me gasping for air. She wasn't even trying to hide it. Didn't she care if I found out? Or maybe she thought I was too spineless to do anything about it. I forced myself to breathe, to focus. I needed proof, irrefutable proof, that would leave no room for her lies. My hands shook as I pulled out my phone and started taking pictures. A part of me wanted to charge inside, to grab her by the shoulders and demand answers. but I knew that would only give her the upper hand. I wasn't ready for a confrontation. Not yet. Instead, I stayed in my car, waiting for them to come out. Hours ticked by, my thoughts spiraling into darker places with each passing minute. I pictured them together, imagined his hands on her, his lips against her neck. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, but I forced myself to remain calm. I would use this fury as fuel. I'd make her regret everything. They emerged just past midnight, both looking slightly disheveled, flushed with that unmistakable postcoital glow. It sickened me. I snapped more photos, quick, shaky shots that captured her laugh, his smirk. Proof the drive home felt surreal, as if I were trapped in someone else's nightmare. I had the proof I needed, but it didn't bring relief. Only a deeper, colder rage. A rage that settled in my bones and made me feel hollow inside. I wanted to confront her, scream at her, throw those pictures in her face, but that wasn't going to be enough. She'd find some way to twist it, to deflect and make me look like the paranoid, overbearing husband. No, I needed more than accusations. I needed to destroy her. The next morning, I hacked into our joint bank account, driven by a need to see the full extent of her betrayal. It was easy enough. I'd always been good with computers, and Bethany had never been cautious with passwords. A few keystrokes, and I was in. My heart pounded as I navigated through the transaction history, scanning for anything out of the ordinary. There it was, a series of charges over the past few months, dinners at high-end restaurants, luxury hotel stays, even a couple of spa visits. Thousands of dollars spent without a word to me. My stomach clenched as I recognized the dates. Those were nights she'd claimed to be working late, the weekends she'd insisted on needing me time. It wasn't just the money, it was the lies, the calculated deceit. I felt like a fool, an idiot who'd been played so expertly that I hadn't even seen it coming. But I saw it now. Every piece of evidence clicked into place, forming a picture of a woman who had systematically dismantled our marriage, brick by brick, until nothing was left. The anger simmered beneath my skin, but I forced myself to stay calm. I needed more. I needed to see what else she'd been hiding. I accessed her email next, searching for any signs of communication with him. At first, it looked like she'd covered her tracks well. Nothing in her inbox, no suspicious names or addresses. But then I noticed a folder tucked away under a nondescript name, miscellaneous. I clicked on it, my pulse racing, and there they were, dozens of emails exchanged between Bethany and a man named Richard Anders. My vision blurred as I scrolled through the messages, my stomach twisting with every line I read. They talked about everything. His work, her frustrations with our marriage, the excitement of sneaking around, the thrill of stealing moments together. I read through each email, my eyes burning with unshed tears. He was everything I wasn't, everything I'd never be. Wealthy, successful, confident. He promised her a life of luxury, of endless excitement, and she'd lapped it all up, like a starving dog being thrown a bone. One email in particular stood out. It was dated just a week ago, and it detailed their plans to spend a weekend at a resort upstate. The same resort I'd suggested for our anniversary 2 years ago. The one she'd said was too expensive, too over the top. I almost laughed at the irony, the bitter sting of it. The final blow came at the end of the email, a single line that seared itself into my brain. I'm leaving him for you. This time, I mean it. It felt like a punch to the gut. I stared at those words until they blurred into meaninglessness. All the anger, the humiliation, the heartbreak, everything condensed into that one promise she'd made to him. A promise to leave me behind like I was nothing more than an old pair of shoes she'd outgrown. I shut the laptop, my hands trembling. The urge to confront her was overwhelming, but I knew I had to be smart about this. I needed to act, but not out of impulse. I needed to dismantle her life with the same precision she'd used to dismantle mine. The thought of her coming back to an empty bank account and a locked house sent a cold thrill through me. But first, I had to make sure I had everything I needed. The next few days were a blur of activity. I took screenshots of every incriminating email, downloaded transaction histories, and saved copies of the messages. I compiled everything into a folder labeled Bethany's Betrayal. It was methodical, almost clinical. I felt detached, as if I were watching myself from the outside, preparing for a war I never wanted to fight. And then I waited. It didn't take long. One evening, I pretended to head out for a late-night grocery run. As soon as I turned the corner, I doubled back and parked a block away from our house. I slipped through the shadows, crouching behind a row of hedges across the street. Sure enough, within minutes, a car pulled up, and Bethany stepped out. She wasn't alone. Richard followed, his hand possessively on her waist as they made their way to our front door. My stomach roiled, but I forced myself to stay still. This was what I needed, the final nail in the coffin. Bethany fumbled with her keys, laughing softly as she tried to unlock the door. Richard leaned in, murmuring something that made her giggle like a teenager. They disappeared inside, and I knew what was coming next. I should have left, but I couldn't. Not yet. I moved silently, creeping up to the front window. Through the crack in the blinds, I saw them, kissing, laughing, touching. It was like a twisted parody of the life we'd once had, a cruel mockery of everything I'd thought we'd built together. Something broke inside me then. All the hurt, all the pain, everything crystallized into a single unwavering thought. She'd taken everything from me, and now it was my turn. I retreated to my car, a plan forming in my mind. I had enough, more than enough. It was time to make her pay. As I drove away, a strange calm settled over me. The storm of emotions raging inside quieted, replaced by a cold, relentless focus. I didn't need to confront her. She wasn't worth it. No, I was going to destroy her, piece by piece, until there was nothing left for her to cling to. With that thought, I knew what I had to do next. Processing the betrayal was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. I've faced disappointments before, a botched promotion, losing a friend over some petty argument, but none of those wounds left the same kind of scar. This one cut deeper, leaving an empty ache in its wake. It wasn't just anger I felt. It was a strange cocktail of emotions that twisted and tangled inside me. Grief, disbelief, humiliation. The life I thought I had was gone, shattered by a single promise she made to him. I'm leaving him for you. This time I mean it. Those words echoed in my mind, poisoning every memory, every shared smile or whispered conversation. I began to see our entire marriage in a new, corrupted light, each tender moment now contaminated by the knowledge of her duplicity. Had she ever meant any of it? Or was I just a convenient place to land until someone better came along? For the first few days after finding the emails, I isolated myself. I went through the motions at work, putting on a mask of normalcy, but inside, I felt like I was drowning. I sat in the darkness of our bedroom, blinds drawn, staring at the wall until the shadows swallowed everything whole. I replayed every interaction in my mind, scrutinizing her tone, her expressions. When did she start to fall out of love? Was it me? Was it something I did or didn't do? Or was it just that he offered her a lifestyle I couldn't compete with? Those thoughts gnawed at me, but I refused to let them break me. No matter how much it hurt, I couldn't let myself sink into self-pity. That's what she wanted, wasn't it? For me to crumble, to fade away quietly so she could slip out of our marriage without a fuss, leaving me behind as a sad little footnote in her glamorous new life. No, that wasn't going to happen. If she was determined to destroy what we had, then I was going to make damn sure she paid for it. The first step was financial. Our joint bank account was a symbol of trust and unity, a place where we both contributed, a shared foundation for our future. Now it was just another battlefield, and I was determined not to lose a single inch. It didn't take long to empty it. A few clicks, a transfer to an untraceable account in my name, and just like that, everything she thought she could rely on was gone. I'd anticipated a confrontation, expected her to notice the missing money and come storming in. But no, she didn't even bother to check. Maybe she was so wrapped up in her fantasy with him that she thought I wouldn't notice either. Or maybe she just didn't care enough to keep track of our shared finances anymore. It didn't matter. The fact that she didn't check made the next step easier. I changed the locks on the house the very next day. Every entryway, every window. I wanted her to feel the walls closing in, to realize that she no longer had a place here. This was my home now, not hers. The satisfaction I felt was a small, bitter triumph, but it was enough to push me forward. I wasn't done yet. I called up our service providers, canceled her phone line, cut off her access to shared utilities. I knew the inconvenience of it would be minor, something she could solve with a few calls of her own, but it was symbolic. She was being excised from my life, one snip at a time. She didn't notice any of it, not the empty bank account, not the disconnected services. Or if she did, she kept silent, still operating under the illusion that I was blissfully ignorant, that she'd somehow managed to wriggle out of this without any repercussions. That only fueled me more. Michoir. It wasn't until I stumbled upon her calendar, meticulously updated and synced to her phone, that I found the opening I needed. It showed every meeting, every dinner, and every scheduled rendezvous with Richard Anders. Seeing his name in the same space as our long-forgotten anniversaries, reminders of weekends we'd once spent together, made my blood boil. But it also gave me an idea. I saved all her contacts and compiled a new email list. Her friends, family, work colleagues, everyone she interacted with regularly. Then I created a new email address, something vague and untraceable, and began uploading photos of her and Richard together. Nothing too explicit, just enough to show their undeniable intimacy. I used captions like "spotted at the Marriott" in "Weekend Getaway" before sending them out, making sure to keep her in the dark. The fallout began almost immediately. Messages from friends poured in, shocked and appalled by what they saw. Some called her directly. Others sent vague replies to the anonymous email asking for more details. I sat back and watched, sipping coffee as my phone buzzed relentlessly with updates. It wasn't enough to ruin her social life. I wanted her entire world to crumble, to have her friends turn on her the way she turned on me. It didn't stop there. I knew Richard had a high-profile position at a finance firm, and while Bethany was discreet in not mentioning his workplace, she'd slip once or twice when talking about his long hours and power lunches. I tracked him down with ease and called his office under the guise of a business inquiry, dropping just enough hints about his personal life to set off alarm bells. A few days later, I followed up with an email to his wife, attaching every piece of evidence I had. I didn't even have to embellish. The photos spoke for themselves. Bethany's world began to unravel. Richard's wife must have confronted him because the next evening, Bethany came home earlier than usual. Her face was pale, eyes wild with a mixture of fear and fury. She tried calling Richard repeatedly, pacing up and down the living room while I watched from the top of the stairs, hidden in the shadows. "Come on, answer me," she hissed, her voice shrill, desperate. When he didn't pick up, she hurled her phone against the wall, shattering it into pieces. That should have made me feel something, vindication, satisfaction. But all I felt was a hollow sense of accomplishment. One step down, several more to go. The next morning, she finally confronted me. I was eating breakfast when she stomped into the kitchen, her face a mask of barely restrained fury. "Mark, what the hell is going on?" she demanded. I set down my fork, meeting her gaze with calm indifference. "What do you mean?" "Don't play dumb with me," she snapped. "The account's empty. My phone's not working. And people are talking, okay? They're saying things about me and Richard. What did you do?" I leaned back in my chair, enjoying the way her bravado crumbled under my silence. Finally, I shrugged. "Why don't you ask Richard? I'm sure he has plenty of answers." For the first time, I saw real fear in her eyes. She stumbled over her words, trying to recover, but I cut her off. "Don't bother pretending," I said softly. "I know everything, Bethany. I know about the dinners, the trips, all of it." The color drained from her face. "Mark, it's not what you think." "Save it." I stood up, looking down at her with a mixture of pity and disgust. "You thought you could just leave me for him, didn't you? Move on and leave me with nothing? Well, good luck getting any money from that empty joint account." She blinked, stunned into silence. For a moment, it seemed like she might try to lie again, to salvage what little dignity she had left. But then she deflated, the fight leaving her all at once. It was a pathetic sight watching her crumple like that, every ounce of confidence drained away. "What do you want?" she whispered. I smiled then, a cold, mirthless smile that felt foreign on my face. "Nothing. I want you gone, Bethany. Out of my life, out of this house. You can keep your lover and whatever mess comes with him." Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She looked lost, cornered, and in that moment I almost felt something like sympathy for her. Almost. I turned away, heading for the door. "You've got 1 week to pack your things," I said over my shoulder. "After that, I'm changing the locks again." Bethany didn't move, didn't speak. I left her standing there, her expression one of shock and desperation, but I didn't look back. The following days were a blur. I leaked more photos, sent messages to her closest friends. I even made sure her office got wind of her indiscretions, forwarding a few key details to her supervisor under the guise of an anonymous tip. It was petty, I knew, but I didn't care. With each new humiliation, each destroyed connection, I felt a little bit of the weight lifting off my shoulders. She tried calling me, pleading, even threatening. But I ignored her every time, letting her voice go to voicemail until her messages were just echoes and muffled apologies. By the end of the week, she was a shell of her former self. When she finally left the house, suitcase in hand, she looked like a ghost, pale, eyes hollowed out with grief. It should have felt like victory. It should have felt good, but it didn't. It felt empty, like winning a game that never really mattered in the first place. Still, I watched her drive away, knowing that this was just the beginning. I hadn't merely hurt her, I'd started tearing down everything she thought she could rely on. And as I stood there, alone on the front porch of our once shared home, I realized that the hollowness inside me was spreading. She was gone, but the pain remained. I watched from the car as she crumbled further, her world disintegrating like sand through fingers. Richard's wife had received my email and reacted exactly as I'd hoped, by confronting him in the most public, humiliating way possible. Their explosive argument was a hot topic among his colleagues, and I'd overheard enough through online whispers and forum posts to know that his cushy position at the firm was now in jeopardy. A career built on connections and appearances couldn't withstand that kind of scandal. But I wasn't content to stop there. It wasn't enough for Bethany to just lose Richard. She needed to feel truly stranded, abandoned by everything and everyone she thought she could rely on. I'd watched her dismiss our marriage, treat it like an inconvenience she had to endure until something better came along. Now I would ensure she was left with nothing, no lifelines, no safety net, just a void where her life used to be. It started with a final brutal blow to her reputation. I had more than enough material to tarnish her image, to smear her name beyond the circles of friends and family. With meticulous precision, I compiled an anonymous dossier on her affair and sent it to every executive in her office. A chain of emails littered with damning evidence, dates times intimate photographs. It painted a picture of a woman who was reckless, dishonest, untrustworthy. I wasn't just burning her professional bridges, I was torching them to the ground. Within days, the fallout reached her. Bethany came home one evening looking like she'd been gutted. There was a hollow look in her eyes, and she moved as though the very act of standing was an effort. I stayed out of sight, watching from the den as she slumped onto the couch, staring blankly at the wall. The silence that filled the room was suffocating. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. It was as if something inside her had broken beyond repair. When she finally spoke, her voice was a ghost of its usual self. They fired me, Mark. Said they can't have someone like me representing the company. Richards, she trailed off, and for a moment, I thought she'd pull herself together, that she'd launch into some tirade or try to deflect blame as she usually did. But then she just shook her head, the fight draining out of her. Richard's leaving too, said it's too messy. Doesn't want to deal with it. I felt a grim satisfaction, but also something darker, colder. It wasn't enough. I wasn't finished yet. You deserve it, I said quietly, stepping out from the shadows. Her head snapped up, eyes widening as if she hadn't even realized I was there. Mark, please. Her voice broke, and she reached out as if to grasp at something, anything. I, I know I hurt you, but I can make it right. We can make it right? I laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that cut through the room. How exactly do you plan on doing that, Bethany? Are you going to undo the affair? Are you going to give back the years you threw away for a man who doesn't even want you anymore? Tears welled up in her eyes, but I felt nothing. She'd shed enough tears over him already. These were just a pathetic afterthought. She stumbled forward, desperation seeping into every word. I'll do whatever it takes. Just don't do this, Mark. Don't shut me out. I have no one left. For a moment, I hesitated. I remembered the woman I'd fallen in love with all those years ago. Remembered how we'd built this life together from the ground up. A part of me, a stupid, stubborn part, wanted to believe that this was still salvageable. That beneath all the lies and betrayal, the woman I loved was still there, waiting to be found. But I pushed that thought away. She'd made her choice. I wasn't going to let pity or nostalgia derail everything I'd set in motion. You did this to yourself, Bethany. You chose him. Now you get to live with the consequences. She crumpled at my words, a broken sob escaping her lips. I turned away, unwilling to let the sight of her weakness sway me. This was what she deserved. This was what she'd earned. She spent the next few days trying to claw back some semblance of control, calling old friends, trying to salvage relationships that I'd already poisoned. They all turned their backs on her. Every call she made ended with a hang-up or a polite refusal. I'd seen to that, planting the seeds of doubt, whispering just enough in their ears to ensure that they wouldn't want to be associated with the train wreck her life had become. On the 5th day, she showed up at the house. I didn't even know she'd gone, hadn't bothered to keep track of her comings and goings after I'd forced her out. But there she was, standing on the front porch, looking like she hadn't slept in days. She was wearing the same clothes I'd seen her in last, wrinkled and stained. The sight of her like that, a shadow of the confident, vibrant woman she'd once been, made something twist painfully inside me. Please, Mark, she begged, her voice barely above a whisper. Let me in. I have nowhere else to go. I stepped outside, closing the door behind me. She flinched as if expecting me to lash out, but I just stood there looking down at her. It was almost pathetic how quickly she'd unraveled, how easily I'd torn her apart. I'm not your backup plan, Bethany, I said softly, my voice devoid of emotion. Go to Richard. Or better yet, go to hell. For a split second, anger flashed in her eyes. It was the first sign of life I'd seen in days, a flicker of the fiery woman I'd known. But it was gone just as quickly, replaced by a hollow acceptance. Richard's gone. Everyone's gone. I have nothing, Mark. No one. Please. Her voice broke and she sank to her knees, hands clutching at my pant leg like a drowning woman clinging to driftwood. I'll do anything. Just don't leave me like this. I shook her off gently, stepping back. No, Bethany, you left me. This is just me returning the favor. She sat there on the porch for a long time after I went back inside, head bowed, shoulders shaking. I watched her through the window, waiting for some reaction, some explosion of anger or sorrow or anything. But she just sat there, alone and defeated. When she finally stood, the sight of her walking away, shoulders slumped, felt like the closing of a chapter. The next morning, I found a letter slipped under the door. Her handwriting was shaky, uneven, the words smudged in places as if she'd written it through tears. I know I can never make things right, but I need you to know that I'm sorry for everything. I should have seen what I had with you, should have appreciated it, but I didn't. And now it's too late. You were right. I did this to myself. I have no one else to blame. I hope someday you can forgive me, even if I don't deserve it. I stared at the note for a long time, the words blurring together. Anger, guilt, satisfaction. It all blended into a cold numbness. I folded the letter and set it aside. I didn't want to think about forgiveness. Didn't want to grapple with whatever remorse I might have felt. She was just trying to manipulate me again, I told myself, trying to worm her way back in with apologies and empty promises. But deep down, something had shifted. Her suffering hadn't brought the closure I'd hoped for. Instead, it left an unsettling emptiness, a gnawing sense that I'd lost something intangible in the process of destroying her. I'd won the game, but at what cost? The day after she showed up one last time. She stood on the porch, a suitcase by her side, looking almost serene. "I'm leaving," she said quietly, her voice calm, resigned. "I just wanted to say goodbye." I didn't respond. I didn't even move. I just watched as she turned and walked down the steps, head held high. For the first time, I saw her not as the villain or the victim, but just someone broken. Someone who'd lost everything because of one bad decision after another. And as much as I wanted to hate her, a part of me, some small, buried part, couldn't help but pity her. I watched her drive away, the taillights disappearing around the corner. She was gone, for good this time. But as I stood there, staring at the empty street, the victory felt hollow. There was no satisfaction, no triumphant sense of justice. Just a vast, yawning emptiness. I had my revenge. But it didn't fill the void she left behind. Bethany's lawsuit arrived at my doorstep less than a week after she left town. I remember the moment I opened it, the envelope thick with legal papers, the sharp scent of fresh ink. I skimmed through it, almost amused by the audacity of her claim. She wanted a portion of the assets, accusing me of fraudulently draining our joint account, manipulating our finances, and leaving her with nothing. The suit painted her as the abandoned wife, victimized and wronged. It was absurd, but it wasn't unexpected. I knew she'd make one final move to try and salvage whatever she could. And this lawsuit, weak and flimsy as it was her last desperate grasp at retribution. I set the papers down and dialed my attorney's number. "It's time," I said simply. "Already on it," came his reply. Within days, we filed a counterclaim. Every transaction, every document she thought she could use against me was accounted for. I'd anticipated her attempt to go after my assets, so I'd made sure to cover every legal base. Our prenup agreement was ironclad, protecting everything I'd acquired before and during our marriage. The joint account she was crying over? We had records showing she'd siphoned off thousands for her little rendezvous with Richard. I was ready. What I wasn't prepared for was how viciously she would try to tear me down in that courtroom. The trial began on a grim Monday morning. It was one of those bleak, overcast days that mirrored the mood inside the courtroom. The air buzzed with anticipation, the murmur of conversation ceasing the moment the judge entered. I caught sight of her as she walked in, flanked by her attorney. She looked composed, almost defiant. But there was a hardness in her eyes that hadn't been there before, a coldness that made my chest tighten. Her lawyer, an opportunistic vulture, launched into a tirade, painting a grotesque picture of me. Mark, the controlling husband. Mark, the manipulative monster who left his poor wife destitute. She even brought up my calculated actions, the emails I'd sent to Richard's wife, the social media leaks. The narrative was twisted and warped, designed to make me look like a sadistic predator who destroyed her out of sheer spite. But none of it held water. My attorney, cool methodical, dismantled their arguments piece by piece. He presented the financial records, showing Bethany's misuse of funds. We displayed photos and emails that proved her affair had been going on long before I'd taken any actions. He pulled out copies of our prenuptial agreement, the judge's gaze flicking over the documents, nodding as he read. Bethany's lawyer tried to counter, but the more they pushed, the more they revealed how deeply tangled she'd become in her lies. Bethany's face grew paler with every passing minute. For all her attempts to smear me, the truth was clearer now than ever before. She was the one who'd initiated the betrayal, who'd siphoned off money for her affair. Everything she'd accused me of, she'd done herself. But worse, because she'd done it behind my back, while pretending to be a loving wife. The turning point came when my attorney asked her point blank about Richard. Mrs. Palmer, can you explain these transactions to the court? Nearly $10,000 in luxury hotel stays over a 6-month period. He held up a bank statement, each charge highlighted in vivid yellow. Bethany hesitated, glancing at her lawyer as if hoping for some last-minute salvation. But her lawyer just stared ahead, face taut with tension. They were for work trips, she said weakly. Work trips? He leaned forward, voice dripping with skepticism. And these work trips just happened to correspond with the exact dates and locations of Richard Anders' itinerary? The same Richard Anders you were seen photographed with at these very hotels? She froze. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. I could see her chest rising and falling rapidly, panic starting to seep in. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. The lawyer clicked, his tongue shaking his head. I'll take that as a no. When Bethany finally took the stand to defend herself, her composure cracked like porcelain under a hammer. She stammered through her testimony, contradicting herself multiple times. Every lie was met with a piece of evidence from my side. It was brutal, watching her unravel in front of a room full of strangers. I almost pitied her, almost. By the end of her testimony, she looked drained, eyes hollow. The judge's expression remained impassive as he reviewed the evidence once more. Then he delivered his verdict, each word punctuated by the quiet shuffling of papers. Given the overwhelming evidence presented, it is clear that Mrs. Palmer's claims are baseless. The prenuptial agreement is valid and binding. All assets acquired by Mr. Palmer are protected under said agreement, and no damages will be awarded to the plaintiff. Furthermore, the evidence of Mrs. Palmer's misuse of funds and infidelity nullifies any claim she might have had to shared assets. The court rules in favor of the defendant. Bethany stood there motionless as the words sunk in. I watched her face crumble, the faint hope she'd clung to dissipating like smoke in the wind. Her shoulders slumped, the weight of the judge's words crushing her. She glanced at me, her eyes wide, pleading silently, but I didn't look away this time. I didn't flinch or turn my gaze aside. I held her stare, letting her see exactly what was left in me. Nothing. When the judge dismissed us, the room erupted into a flurry of motion. Lawyers gathered their papers, voices rising as they discussed the case. I remained seated, my gaze fixed on her as she stumbled down from the stand. She looked lost, like a child wandering through a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. I stood up slowly, gathering my things. As I moved past her, she reached out, her fingers brushing against my arm. "Mark," she whispered, voice trembling, "please don't do this. Don't leave me like this. I know I hurt you, but..." I jerked away, the touch burning like acid. "You left me long before this, Bethany. Remember that." Her face contorted, a mixture of anguish and regret flashing across her features. I didn't think you'd..." "Fight back?" I finished for her, my voice cold. "No, you didn't. You thought I'd roll over, let you walk away with everything. Well, here we are. You get nothing. Absolutely nothing." I turned on my heel, walking out of the courtroom without looking back. Each step felt heavy, laden with the weight of everything that had just transpired. I'd gotten what I wanted: victory, justice, closure. But the farther I walked, the more I realized how empty it all felt. Outside, the sky was still overcast, the same dull gray it had been all day. I inhaled deeply, the cold air stinging my lungs. It should have been exhilarating, winning like this. But all I felt was an unsettling void. Bethany's defeat was absolute. Her reputation was ruined. She had no friends, no boss, no money. She'd been stripped of everything she'd used to define herself. And now she'd disappear. That much I was certain of. I stood at the courthouse steps, watching as people filtered out around me. Bethany emerged a few minutes later, her face drawn, eyes red-rimmed and hollow. She paused at the top of the steps, glancing around as if hoping to see something familiar, something safe. But there was nothing for her here, no comfort, no solace. For a moment, her gaze found mine. She looked at me, really looked at me, and something inside her seemed to shatter. She turned and walked away, her shoulders hunched, her steps unsteady. As I watched her go, a strange feeling settled over me. Relief, maybe? A sense of freedom. But it was tinged with a profound sadness. A realization that in destroying her, I'd lost something of myself along the way. I left the courthouse alone, my footsteps echoing in the silence. There was no satisfaction, no thrill of victory. Just a lingering emptiness, a gnawing sense that winning had cost me more than I'd bargained for. Bethany was gone. I was free, but I'd never felt more trapped. The aftermath of revenge was a hollow wasteland, devoid of warmth or light. And as I walked away from that place, the bitterness of it settled deep in my bones. I'd gotten what I wanted. But was it truly worth it? Only time would tell. After Bethany's departure from the courtroom and subsequently from my life, I struggled to comprehend what came next. I had achieved everything I set out to do. She was gone, her reputation destroyed, her life in ruins. But I was left standing amidst the rubble, wondering what victory was supposed to feel like. Was this it? This emptiness? This hollow space that echoed with the sound of my own loneliness? Days turned into weeks, and I found myself slipping into a routine of numb detachment. I would go to work, go through the motions, but my mind was adrift, untethered. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd lost something fundamental along the way. There were no more battles left to fight, no more lies to expose. Bethany was just a ghost now, and I was haunted by the remnants of what we once had. One night, after a particularly grueling day at the office, I found myself staring blankly at the reflection in my bathroom mirror. I didn't recognize the man looking back at me. There was a coldness in his eyes, an edge of bitterness that had settled into the lines of his face. The anger that had fueled me for so long had burned out, leaving behind only exhaustion and a creeping sense of regret. It took a long time for me to admit that I needed help. Reaching out to a therapist felt like defeat, an acknowledgement that I wasn't as strong or as self-assured as I'd pretended to be. But I knew deep down that if I didn't confront what I was feeling, I'd never be free of it. So I made the call, scheduled the appointment, and began the slow, painful process of untangling everything I'd buried inside. The sessions were grueling at first. I'd go in, sit across from the therapist, a calm, patient woman named Dr. Reeves, and stare at the floor. My words caught my throat. It took weeks before I could speak Bethany's name without feeling a rush of anger or sadness. When I finally started talking, it came out in a torrent. Everything I'd held back, all the rage, the betrayal, the emptiness. I spoke about how I'd felt like a fool, how I'd questioned my own worth, how every part of me had wanted to destroy her, to make her feel the pain she'd caused me. Dr. Reeves listened quietly, never judging, only occasionally offering a gentle nudge. "And did it help, Mark?" she asked one session, leaning forward slightly. "Hurting her. Did it give you the closure you were looking for?" I'd paused, staring at my hands. "No," I said finally, "it didn't." "Why do you think that is?" I didn't have an answer then, but over the next few months, I began to unravel the truth of it. The revenge had been an outlet, a way to channel my grief and anger. It gave me a sense of purpose when everything else was falling apart. But it hadn't addressed the real issue, my inability to let go of what I'd lost. I was still clinging to the pain, wrapping it around myself like a shield, refusing to let it go because it felt like the last connection I had to who I used to be. Gradually, I started reconnecting with old friends, people I hadn't spoken to in years. Some welcomed me back with open arms, while others were more cautious, unsure of what to make of the version of me that emerged from the wreckage. But those small steps, grabbing coffee with an old colleague, catching up over drinks with a former college buddy, began to pull me out of the dark place I'd been trapped in. I started going out more, attending events, volunteering for projects at work that I would have shied away from before. And slowly I felt the weight lift, the bitterness fading like an old scar. I wasn't healed, far from it, but I was beginning to feel like a person again, not just a vessel for anger and regret. I threw myself into my job, taking on new responsibilities, even accepting a promotion I'd turned down years ago because Bethany had convinced me it wasn't worth the extra hours. For the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of pride in my work, a sense of accomplishment that didn't come from tearing someone else down. My evenings, once spent brooding in silence, became filled with new pursuits. I picked up old hobbies I'd abandoned, woodworking, sketching. I even joined a local gym, finding an unexpected solace in the rhythm of exercise, the mindless repetition of pushing myself to the limit and then a little further. Each lift, each jog felt like a small victory, a reclamation of my own strength. But it wasn't until I took a long, hard look at the house, our house, the one Bethany and I had built together, that I realized I couldn't truly move forward while I was still surrounded by the past. Every corner, every room held memories of her, of us, before everything fell apart. The ghosts of our shared life lingered in every shadow, whispering reminders of what I'd lost. So I sold it. It was a painful decision, but a necessary one. Letting go of the house felt like severing the final tie that bound me to her. I moved into a smaller place on the other side of town, a clean slate free of the taint of betrayal. The new apartment was bright, minimalist, devoid of clutter. It felt like a blank canvas waiting for me to fill it with whatever came next. I began exploring the city, discovering parts of it I'd never taken the time to appreciate. I found a quiet cafe tucked away on a side street where I'd spend hours reading or chatting with the barista who always seemed to know when I needed a strong cup of coffee. I took up hiking, losing myself in the serenity of nature, finding peace in the steady rhythm of my footsteps on the trail. One morning, while standing at the peak of a nearby hill, watching the sunrise, I felt something I hadn't in a long time: hope. The golden light washed over the landscape, casting everything in a warm, gentle glow. It was as if the world itself was offering me a fresh start, a chance to leave the bitterness and anger behind and embrace whatever lay ahead. I breathed deeply, letting the crisp morning air fill my lungs, and for the first time since this entire ordeal began, I felt free. Free from the weight of the past, free from the suffocating need for vengeance, free to move forward and rebuild, not just my life, but myself. I accepted that Bethany would always be a part of my story, a chapter that I couldn't erase, no matter how much I wished I could, but she didn't define me anymore. I'd made my peace with the scars she left, choosing not to hide them, but to let them remind me of what I'd endured and survived. With time, I even found myself considering the possibility of new relationships. I didn't rush into it, didn't dive headfirst like I might have before. Instead, I took my time getting to know people, allowing myself to trust again, even if only a little bit at first. I met someone, a kind, intelligent woman named Rachel, who'd been through her own set of challenges. We started out slowly, just friends grabbing dinner or a movie, and as the months passed, something genuine and unforced began to blossom. Rachel understood my hesitations, never pushed me to be more than I was ready to be. With her, I didn't feel like I had to hide my past or pretend to be someone I wasn't. She accepted the damaged parts of me without judgment, and that acceptance gave me the courage to open up in ways I hadn't thought possible. I'm not saying everything fell neatly into place. I still had moments of doubt, days where I'd wake up with a lingering sense of unease, the ghosts of old memories rattling their chains. But those moments grew fewer, their hold on me weakening as I built something new, something I could be proud of. One evening, almost a year after the courtroom battle that had severed the final ties between Bethany and me, I found myself standing by the window of my new apartment, watching the sunset. The sky blazed with vibrant hues of orange and pink, a sight that once would have filled me with a sense of loss. But now it just felt peaceful. As the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon, I took a deep breath, feeling the cool breeze brush against my skin. There was a lightness in my chest, a quiet contentment that had been absent for so long. I'd come a long way from that broken man, consumed by bitterness and rage. I'd rebuilt. I'd survived. And now, as I watched the world fade into twilight, I knew I was finally ready to move on.